Welcome to a new episode of In Peace Stories. Our story today will take us to Liberia. Liberia is a small country in West Africa. And during the early period of 1990s, perhaps from 1990 to 1995 or 96, it went through a vicious civil war between different factions. That civil war led to the destruction and death of so many people, and the whole country was getting very exhausted from all the suffering for many years. I will share today two stories. One story will be about what do we mean by peace, and the other story will relate to how history can be used to build peace. On the first story about the meaning of peace, what happened is after the war settled eventually, actually due to the victory of one of the factions under Charles Taylor, at least he brought some stability, I mean security stability to the country that was badly needed. And at that time, we went to Liberia to conduct research in the late 90s about peace building programs and how they are conducted and with what level of contribution to the livelihood of people. Part of our research included a survey on the streets. We wanted to ask people what they think of the peace building programs that are available. Are they making a difference, and in which way? I remember one of the questions in the survey was, what does peace mean to you? What will happen that will make you say there is peace in the country? And I remember one woman, when we asked her that question, she said, peace for me means that my son can go to school without being shot at. Yep, that's it. All she wanted was the safety of her son when he is going to school and that nobody will shoot at him. That was her highest expectation that she wanted from what peace will mean. Of course, under different situations, people may long for something much more than that. They will long for social cohesion, for development, for post-conflict reconstruction, and many important elements that can move us towards what we call positive peace. But we should not underestimate that under certain circumstances, for some people in times of war and conflict, the best they can long for will be just a stopping of violence. And this might be the most realistic objective that peacemakers can strive to achieve at a certain point. We cannot always elevate our expectations and the expectations of everyone else that for every conflict we must have conflict transformation and full peace building and positive peace. We like to see this definitely, but we have to assess the situation and to understand that at a certain point, stopping the violence, negative peace, and some level of peacekeeping may be the best we can achieve. Maybe later we can see if the circumstances change or if we can effect a change in the circumstances that we can start to move forward towards a more form of positive peace. However, how we decide this has to relate back to what is important to people and what they see to be realistic and that they need for their own livelihood. I again assert the point, we cannot come with our own frameworks and assume that what we want to do is the right thing for people. People know better what they need for themselves. And we need to connect with them on that level and develop programs that will achieve this. The second story relates to the notion of history and how it is used for peacemaking and peace building. And that story actually came from a situation that I learned that happened after the stability that took place in terms of security for a couple of years and things were getting better. Suddenly there was an eruption of violence between two ethnic groups in the northern part of the country in Lufa County. Violence erupted in one community between members of two groups, the Lorma and the Mandingos. Those are two huge ethnic groups that exist across the entire West Africa and beyond. And as the fighting started in that community and some members of each community were killed, murdered, businesses and homes were burned down and things were really getting out of control, the government got notice of what happened and they were afraid that if they don't intervene quickly, the news of the violence will spread all over the country, and before you know it, we are going back to the same point of the civil war one more time. So the government quickly dispatched a minister who was from that community, and he quickly went there to try to deal with the situation. I interviewed that minister, and he told me that about the approach he used to work with the leaders of the two communities. He told me that He knew the community well. He knew the two groups. He knew the history of the two groups. And he knew that the history of the relationship between the two groups over the years has been actually very positive. And that what happened was really an exception and very strange. And he decided to rely on the positive history as one of the tools for how he would work on making peace between them. So when he went there and he gathered the leaders of the two groups, he said to them that before we talk about what happened and who killed who and who burned what, I want you to first share with me and recount the story of the relationships between your two groups for the last 300 years. This is not a strange question. Many of those communities are used to share oral history of their communities, and they take it from generation to generation, and they can always sit and tell you the story of their community or group orally. So the two groups or the leaders started to share the stories. And as they were sharing those stories, they were talking about very positive examples. One time your community suffered from famine and we came and provided you support. One time there was a hurricane and we stood together and supported each other. One time there was a common enemy and together we fought against the common enemy. They kept going through history, sharing all those positive stories about how they related to each other, until they came close to the day of this conflict that just erupted. And that's when the minister said to them, so if you have had this great history with each other, are you going to be the ones who will ruin 300 years of positive relationships and healthy connection between the two groups? How will generations that have passed and generations that will come will look at you and judge you? In other words, he was transforming their sense of self rather than being leaders of antagonistic groups and they are responsible to win as much as they can at the expense of the other. Now they see themselves as leaders responsible to history. Every action, everything they will do will be judged by history. And they needed to live up to the standard of their ancestors who succeeded in building healthy relationship over decades and centuries. And after he reset that mode and sense of self, he was able to get into the details of what happened and who committed what crimes and who deserved compensation. And they produced some form of transitional justice, where some people who committed major crimes, of course, were sent to the security and to the court system. Others, there were compensations that were accepted, and maybe in other situations also they agreed on some level of forgiveness and so on. In addition, they developed mechanisms for the community to prevent such conflicts from becoming violent in the future. And they set up some early warning methods and agreed on how to deal with this in the future. And then they had a big celebration for the whole community to announce the peace agreement. I share that story to highlight that there are many different ways of how we can make peace. And while we all know the standard classic approaches, bring the two parties, develop a peaceful setting where you can have them share what do you want, what are your issues, and how can we find a common ground or a way to satisfy both of them simultaneously. Ultimately, that's what we want to do. But if there are other elements in our assessment based on history, based on relationship, based on other contextual factors that can work in our advantage to advance peace, then we should actually make use of them. And this minister brilliantly, and knowing that history was positive between them, he knew how to use history to transform the whole setting of the peace process to make it healthy and conducive for generating a peaceful, lasting peace agreement. And there are many examples like of this that we can see in any conflict that we can assess. What we need to know is to be cognizant and aware of those dimensions beyond the narrow, limited dimensions of party A, party B, what is the issue, what is the interest, and let us try to satisfy them. That is the core. But there are many, many influences that we need to take into consideration as well. I hope that you found that story useful, and until more stories in peace. Amen.